When a young Filipino activist stood before some of the most powerful people on Earth at the United Nations Climate Conference, nobody expected what happened next. Her words cut through years of diplomatic politeness and forced the world to confront an uncomfortable truth. The room went silent. Some leaders shifted in their seats, others looked away. Because what she said exposed something they had been trying to ignore for decades. This is the story of how one voice from the Philippines changed the conversation about climate change forever. The Philippines sits in the eye of the storm, both literally and figuratively. Every single year, roughly 20 tropical cyclones form in the western Pacific Ocean, and about half of them directly slam into this island nation. That means Filipinos don't read about climate disasters in newspapers. They live through them. They watch their homes get swept away. They lose family members to floods and landslides. They rebuild only to see everything destroyed again a few months later. For them, climate change isn't a debate or a theory, it's a matter of survival.
Imagine waking up one morning and seeing dark clouds gathering on the horizon. You know what's coming because you've been through it before. The wind picks up, the rain starts. Within hours, your entire neighborhood is underwater. You grab your children and whatever belongings you can carry and rush to an evacuation center. But here's the thing. You're not just dealing with one typhoon. In November alone, during the brutal season of recent years, 6 consecutive storm systems battered the country in under a month. 6 major typhoons, 1 month. The same communities were hit over and over again. People were displaced 3 times in 30 days. Emergency responders couldn't keep up because they were still dealing with the damage from the previous storm when the next one arrived.
This isn't fiction. This is the reality for millions of Filipinos. Between the end of October and mid-November, in the catastrophic season that shook the nation, the Philippines experienced something meteorologists called unprecedented. Severe tropical storms and super typhoons came one after another like a relentless assault. Schools closed, airports shut down, entire provinces declared states of calamity. Hundreds of thousands of families lost their homes. The economic damage reached billions of pesos, and the mental toll? Immeasurable. How do you explain to a child why their bedroom is underwater again? How do you comfort someone who has lost everything for the 3rd time in a single year? Scientists studying this phenomenon discovered something alarming. They found that climate change has made these rapid clustering events significantly more likely. In our current climate that is already warmed by over 1 degree Celsius, the Philippines can expect 3 major typhoons to make landfall in a single month, roughly once every 15 years. That's 25% more frequent than in a world without climate change. And if global temperatures rise to 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, these devastating events will happen even more often. The Philippines isn't experiencing bad luck. It's experiencing the frontline impacts of a climate crisis that the country did almost nothing to cause. Think about that for a moment. The Philippines contributes very little to global carbon emissions compared to wealthy industrialized nations. Yet Filipinos are paying the highest price. They're drowning in floods caused by emissions from coal plants halfway around the world. They're losing their livelihoods because multinational corporations prioritized profit over the planet. It's a cruel irony. The people who have done the least to create this crisis are suffering the most from its consequences. This is what climate activists call climate injustice, and it's this injustice that fueled the fire in the voice of the young Filipino who stood before world leaders and refused to stay silent. Her name became synonymous with courage. Born in Metro Manila and educated in mathematics, she could have chosen a comfortable career path. Instead, she chose to fight. Her awakening came in a profound way when she met with indigenous leaders from the Lumad community. These indigenous peoples told her stories of militarization, displacement, harassment, and violence, all because they dared to defend their forests and their ancestral lands. They had no choice but to resist, because their very survival depended on it. This encounter changed everything. She realized that individual actions weren't enough. What the world needed was collective action and systemic change.
So in the midst of a global youth climate movement inspired by strikes happening around the world, she helped establish Youth Advocates for Climate Action Philippines. This organization became the Philippine branch of Fridays for Future, a movement demanding that governments take the climate crisis seriously. She didn't just organize local protests, she brought the voices of the most vulnerable communities to the international stage. She addressed the United Nations Secretary General. She spoke at major climate conferences. She looked world leaders in the eye and told them the truth they didn't want to hear.
At one particularly powerful moment during a UN climate conference, she stood at the podium with other young activists and delivered words that would echo around the world. She talked about anger, real, justified anger. She was furious that the conference couldn't even mention fossil fuels in the final agreement text. She pointed out the absurdity that fossil fuel lobbyists had a bigger delegation at the climate summit than any single country. More than 500 representatives from oil, gas, and coal companies were there, outnumbering the delegates from vulnerable nations. These were the very industries responsible for the crisis, and they had more influence at the negotiating table than the people suffering from rising seas and devastating storms. She spoke about what it was like to live in one of the most climate-vulnerable countries on Earth. She talked about the exhaustion of having to repeatedly share her climate trauma and climate anxiety just to make people understand the urgency. She was tired of explaining that the crisis was already here, tired of begging for action, tired of watching her people suffer while the richest countries dragged their feet on commitments they made years ago. Her voice cracked with emotion, but never wavered. Because she wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for every Filipino who lost a home, every family separated by disaster, every child who grew up afraid of the rainy season. What makes her message so powerful is that it exposes the hypocrisy at the heart of global climate politics. Wealthy nations talk about reducing emissions and meeting climate goals. They make promises at international conferences. They sign agreements and set targets. But then they continue subsidizing fossil fuel companies. They approve new coal plants and oil pipelines. They prioritize economic growth over planetary survival. Meanwhile, countries like the Philippines are left to deal with the consequences. It's like watching someone set your house on fire and then offering you a bucket of water while they keep pouring gasoline. The numbers tell a devastating story. Studies show that the Philippines is hit by more typhoons every year than almost any other country in the world. An average of 20 tropical cyclones develop around the Philippines annually. That's roughly one every 18 days during peak season. 7 of the 11 strongest typhoon landfalls in recorded history have occurred since the early part of this century. The storms are getting stronger. They're happening more frequently, they're causing more damage, and the people living through these disasters can see the change happening right before their eyes. The World Bank estimates that the annual economic impact of typhoons costs the Philippines around 1.2% of its gross domestic product. That translates to billions of dollars in damage to infrastructure, loss of agricultural production, decreased labor productivity, and disrupted consumption patterns. But these are just economic figures. They don't capture the human cost. They don't measure the trauma of watching your community destroyed. They don't quantify the grief of losing loved ones. They don't account for the mental health crisis that emerges after repeated disasters. Research conducted after major typhoons revealed something troubling about the psychological impact. survivors don't always show signs of distress immediately. During the disaster, survival instinct takes over. You focus on escaping danger and protecting your family. But 3 to 6 months later, when people have reached relative safety and the immediate crisis is past, that's when the mental health effects emerge. Post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety. These conditions affect thousands of people after every major storm, and in the Philippines, there's barely time to heal from one disaster before the next one strikes. Young activists like the Filipino speaker at the UN understand this intimately. They've grown up in a world where climate anxiety isn't some abstract concern. It's a rational response to living under constant threat. She has described the feeling as a quiet presence that comes in waves. You don't know how it's going to look or feel until it arrives. It's there when you're scrolling through your phone and see storm warnings. It's there when dark clouds gather on the horizon. It's the fear of drowning in your own bedroom, the fear of being swept away by floods. And this fear isn't irrational. It's based on lived experience and the knowledge that people with power are choosing to do nothing. She calls fossil fuels the new weapons of mass destruction. And she's right. Coal, oil, and natural gas are literally fueling the storms that tear through her country. The carbon emissions from burning these fuels warm the ocean waters. Warmer waters create stronger, more frequent typhoons. These typhoons destroy communities and kill people. The connection is direct and undeniable. Yet fossil fuel companies continue extracting and burning these resources. Governments continue subsidizing these industries, and the people of the Philippines continue suffering the consequences. But what makes this young activist's message so compelling isn't just the facts she presents. It's the way she frames the issue as a matter of justice. She talks about anti-imperialism and anti-colonization in the context of climate. She points out that the same power dynamics that allowed wealthy nations to exploit colonized countries for resources are now playing out in the climate crisis. Rich countries industrialized by burning fossil fuels and got wealthy. Now they're telling developing countries they can't do the same because of climate change. But they're not providing adequate support for these countries to transition to clean energy or adapt to climate impacts. It's another form of injustice layered on top of historical exploitation. When she speaks, she doesn't just represent youth. She represents the most affected peoples and areas. She works to amplify voices from the global south, particularly from countries that are bearing the brunt of climate impacts, despite contributing least to the problem. She organizes with other activists from regions experiencing similar struggles. They share stories, build solidarity, and demand accountability from the corporations and countries most responsible for the crisis. Because they understand that their fights are connected. A coal plant in one country creates emissions that fuel a typhoon in another. An oil pipeline approved in the global north contributes to sea level rise in island nations. Everything is connected. The Philippines demonstrates climate vulnerability in ways that should serve as a wake-up call for the entire world. The country sits in what disaster experts call the typhoon belt. It's positioned along the Pacific Ring of Fire, making it susceptible to earthquakes and volcanic eruptions on top of the constant typhoon threat. More than 60% of the population lives in coastal zones that are increasingly threatened by rising seas and storm surges. Deforestation has made flooding and landslides worse. Rapid construction without adequate planning has created vulnerable infrastructure, and poverty means that millions of people lack the resources to properly prepare for or recover from disasters. This vulnerability is compounded by something called displacement. Between the time comprehensive disaster data became available and recent years, over 62 million new internal displacements linked to disasters have been recorded in the Philippines. 62 million times that people were forced to flee their homes because of typhoons, floods, earthquakes, or volcanic eruptions. In a single year, during one particularly brutal stretch, disasters triggered 2.6 million internal displacements, with 81% caused by storms and floods alone. These aren't just statistics. These are families torn apart, children separated from schools, communities scattered across evacuation centers, lives put on hold while people wait to see if they'll have a home to return to. The displacement creates its own set of problems. Evacuation centers become overcrowded. Access to clean water and sanitation becomes limited. Disease spreads easily in cramped conditions. And during a global pandemic, these evacuation centers became potential hotspots for virus transmission. Imagine having to choose between staying in your home during a typhoon and risking your life, or evacuating to a crowded shelter and risking infection. This is the impossible choice that many Filipinos faced during recent years, when typhoons continued despite the health crisis. Sea level rise adds another layer of threat. The Philippines is experiencing sea level rise more than 3 times faster than the global average. Coastal communities are watching their land disappear beneath the waves. Saltwater intrusion is contaminating freshwater sources and destroying agricultural land. By some projections, significant portions of coastal areas could be underwater within decades if current trends continue. This isn't a distant future problem, it's happening now. Families are already being forced to relocate. Entire communities are planning for the day they'll have to abandon their ancestral homes. Yet, despite all of this vulnerability and suffering, the international response has been inadequate. When 6 typhoons struck in a single month during that unprecedented season, humanitarian organizations called for $32.9 million to support the most vulnerable people affected. That might sound like a lot of money, but consider that this was to help 210,000 people out of nearly 900,000 in need of immediate assistance. The United Nations Central Emergency Response Fund allocated $3.5 million, but that was nowhere near enough. Additional funding was desperately needed, and the appeal went out to the international community for support. Every delay in funding means more suffering for people who have already lost everything.
This is where the young activist's message becomes most powerful. She's not just describing problems, she's demanding justice and accountability. She and other climate activists from vulnerable regions have been calling for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. This proposed treaty would stop the expansion of any new oil, gas, and coal production and begin phasing out existing production. It would treat fossil fuels like the threat they are, similar to how the world has treaties to control nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction. Because that's what fossil fuels have become. They're destroying the climate that makes life on Earth possible.
The demand for this treaty isn't radical. It's based on science. Climate scientists have been clear that we need to rapidly reduce carbon emissions to avoid catastrophic warming. We can't do that while continuing to extract and burn fossil fuels at current rates, let alone expanding production. Every new oil well drilled, every new coal mine opened, every new gas pipeline built locks us into decades more emissions. It makes the climate targets that countries have agreed to impossible to reach. It condemns millions more people to suffer from climate impacts. And it disproportionately harms the people who contributed least to creating the problem. When the young Filipino activist speaks about these issues, she brings an intersectional analysis that many climate discussions lack. She talks about how climate justice is inseparable from social justice, how environmental destruction often targets indigenous communities and marginalized groups, how the same systems that exploit workers also exploit the environment, how patriarchy, colonialism, capitalism, and climate destruction are all connected. This broader analysis helps people understand that addressing climate change requires transforming the systems that created the crisis in the first place. It's not enough to switch to renewable energy while maintaining the same exploitative economic structures. Real change requires reimagining how societies are organized.
Her activism extends beyond speeches and conferences. She works directly with vulnerable communities in the Philippines, creating climate education modules that are contextualized to local experiences. Rather than using technical jargon or Western-centric frameworks, these modules connect climate science to what people are actually experiencing in their daily lives. They explain why the typhoons are getting worse. They help communities understand their rights. They build collective power so that people can demand action from their government and hold corporations accountable. This grassroots organizing is just as important as the international advocacy work because lasting change requires mobilizing people at every level.
The challenges she faces in this work are significant. The Philippines has been identified as one of the most dangerous countries in the world for environmental defenders. Activists who challenge powerful interests, whether mining companies, fossil fuel corporations, or destructive development projects, face intimidation, harassment, and violence. Some have been assassinated. Others have been falsely labeled as terrorists or communists in a practice called red tagging that aims to discredit and endanger activists. Speaking out for the environment and for vulnerable communities requires enormous courage because the risks are real. Yet she and countless others continue the fight because the alternative, staying silent while their country and planet are destroyed, is unacceptable. The Filipino climate movement represents something larger than one country's struggle. It's a voice for all the communities on the front lines of climate change who rarely get heard in international negotiations. Island nations facing complete submersion. Arctic communities watching their land melt. African regions experiencing devastating droughts. Latin American rainforests being destroyed. Indigenous peoples around the world defending their territories. All of these groups are fighting similar battles against similar forces, and they're building solidarity with each other, recognizing that their liberation is connected. What happened when this young activist spoke at the UN wasn't just one powerful speech. It was a moment when the carefully constructed narratives of climate negotiations were disrupted by truth. The truth that current climate policies are inadequate. The truth that fossil fuel interests have too much power. The truth that the people suffering most from climate change are being excluded from decisions about their own futures. The truth that time is running out and incremental changes won't be enough. These truths made some leaders uncomfortable because acknowledging them means acknowledging their failure to act with appropriate urgency. But discomfort isn't enough. The Filipino activist and her fellow climate justice advocates aren't looking for sympathy or empty promises. They're demanding concrete action. Phase out fossil fuels. Provide climate financing for vulnerable countries. Include frontline communities in decision-making. Hold corporations accountable for their emissions and their role in spreading climate disinformation. Transfer technology and resources to help developing countries adapt to climate impacts and build renewable energy systems. Honor commitments that have already been made. These demands are clear, and they're based on what science says is necessary to avoid catastrophic warming.
The response from some quarters has been encouraging. More countries are acknowledging the need to transition away from fossil fuels. Renewable energy is becoming cheaper and more widespread. Young people around the world are mobilizing and demanding action. Courts in some countries are ruling that governments have a legal obligation to protect citizens from climate change. Indigenous communities are successfully defending their territories against destructive projects. Progress is happening. But it's not happening fast enough, and the gap between what's needed and what's being done remains dangerously wide.
This is why voices like that of the young Filipino activist are so crucial. They keep the pressure on. They refuse to let the world forget about the communities already experiencing climate catastrophe. They challenge the narrative that climate action is too expensive or too difficult by pointing out that inaction is far more costly in human lives and suffering. They remind everyone that behind the statistics and scientific projections are real people with families, dreams, and the right to a livable future. Their testimony makes it impossible to treat climate change as an abstract future threat when it's a present reality for billions of people.
The story of Filipino climate activism is ultimately a story about resilience and determination in the face of overwhelming challenges. It's about people who have every reason to despair, choosing instead to fight. It's about communities that keep rebuilding after every disaster, not because they're resigned to this cycle, but because they believe a better future is possible. It's about a generation of young people who inherited a climate crisis they didn't create, but who refused to accept it as inevitable. They're organizing, speaking out, and demanding the transformative change needed to build a just and sustainable world.
When that young activist stood before world leaders and spoke her truth, she didn't change everything overnight. The fossil fuel industry is still powerful. Governments are still moving too slowly. Emissions are still too high. Vulnerable communities are still suffering. But she did something important. She bore witness. She made it harder for people to look away or make excuses. She planted seeds that will grow into larger movements. She inspired others to raise their voices. She reminded the world that the climate crisis is a human crisis, and that humanity has both the responsibility and the capacity to address it. That's the truth that left world leaders speechless, and that's the truth that just might change everything.